Most men who built empires did so by living long lives. Augustus was able to create the Roman Empire because he lived till 75. Suleiman the Magnificent expanded the Ottoman Empire to its greatest territorial extent because he lived to 71. And while we are captivated by figures like Julius Caesar or JFK, men whose untimely deaths leave us wondering, what if? Their tragedies lie in what they didn't achieve. Alexander the Great breaks all the rules. He died at just 32, yet he brought the world to its knees. In just over a decade, he conquered 6,000 miles from Greece to India. He didn't stop because of defeat, but because his men, weary of endless fighting, simply refused to march further. Even though he died without a clear heir and his empire fractured almost immediately, the 4 resulting kingdoms survived for another 300 years. His vision of Hellenism, blending East and West, reshaped trade and culture for generations. Cities he founded, such as Alexandria, became hubs of knowledge, preserving ideas that would influence the world for centuries. Alexander changed everything, and he could have just been getting started. So today's question is, what if Alexander had lived? What could one of history's greatest conquerors have accomplished with 30 more years? 11 days before his death, Alexander the Great drank a large bowl of wine in honor of Hercules and was almost immediately struck with terrible stomach pain. He became so sick that even common soldiers grew anxious and were eventually allowed to walk past him while he silently waved. Then he died. So what could have been lurking in that fateful bowl of wine? White hellebore is the most likely culprit, a slow-acting poison that does indeed cause terrible stomach pain. Alexander's general, Antipater, appears to be the historical villain who killed Alexander the Great. Older and ruthless, Antipater was one of Philip II, Alexander's dad's, most prized hetairoi, or battle companions. After Philip's death, he helped Alexander take the throne, and then became his regent in Greece and Macedon. While Alexander was off campaigning, he stayed behind, crushing any revolts that arose. In 324 BCE, Alexander ordered Antipater to take troops into Asia, so his good friend Craterus could take over Macedonia. With Alexander's death, this, of course, never happened. Who became supreme regent after Alexander's death? Antipater. And who was Alexander's cupbearer? Antipater's son, Iollas. But imagine if, on that fateful day, Iollas had lost his nerve. He might have nervously explained the plot to Alexander, begging his forgiveness for even being tangentially involved in such a plan. Alexander was not known for cruelty against his men. He'd been merciful before. He might have accepted Iollas's apology and waited for Antipater's arrival in Babylon. Picture the scene. Antipater arriving in Babylon, confident that Alexander's death would be the key to his rise. Instead, he's met by his fellow generals, assembled to witness his public execution at the hands of the king he had betrayed. Alexander was known to be a bit of a drunk, who lost himself in his cups, especially when trapped somewhere with the mundane acts of ruling as opposed to being off on a glorious battle. And he had been distracted at that time, mourning the sudden loss of his lover Hephaestion. But he had just publicly killed someone he had truly believed he could trust. And clearly it was time to reconsider his life choices. He could have died, and he might not have ever finished conquering the world. So, Alexander rolls up his sleeves and gets to work planning his new campaign, the conquest of Arabia. Arabia was wealthy in spices, the coastline was fertile, and it was ripe for the taking. In 324 BCE, Alexander sent naval expeditions to survey the Arabian coast, their mission clear: chart every inlet, every harbor, and assess the strength of local defenses. When they returned with reports of scattered, under-equipped forces, Alexander knew his armies could carve through this land with ease. While Alexander was planning this conquest, one of his wives, Roxana, gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. Alexander christens the boy Alexander IV and declares that he has indeed been blessed by the gods. Alexander chooses to let the boy grow up in Babylon, guaranteeing that his heir would indeed be as Persian as he was Greek. For the most part, Arabia is an easy campaign for the battle-hardened Macedonians. The conquest of Arabia meets little resistance, until Alexander's forces reach the towering rock fortress of Petra, held by the fiercely independent Nabateans. Perched high among the cliffs, the fort seems unassailable, with natural defenses that turn away even the bravest of Alexander's siege engineers. For 2 grueling months, the Macedonians toil under the blistering desert sun, constructing siege towers and scaling the heights under constant attack. Finally, Alexander makes a secret deal with some of the city's merchants, and one night, The gate of the city was accidentally left open. Alexander's troops pour in, Petra falls, and Alexander's conquest of Arabia is complete. He declares that the site would be his new capital for his new province, Hephaestopolis, in honor of his dead love. Hephaestopolis is to be a beacon of Macedonian culture, a city carved into the desert that exists to this day. Alexander returns home, satisfied and victorious. But he has one other major conquest on his to-do list, and that is Carthage. Alexander knows that Carthage is going to be a bigger campaign, so he's settling back into considering his invasion of Carthage when an unexpected gift landed in his lap. Agathocles, the tyrant of Syracuse, appears with a desperate request. Carthage has invaded the island of Sicily, and the Syracusans are only managing to hold out on a small part of the land, backed by their Italian allies, but they do not have long. Alexander is only too happy to help, provided Agathocles becomes a client king. Agathocles is a bit freaked out by how Persian Alexander has become, expecting prostration in his presence and acting as if he is a living god. But he recognizes the pragmatism of Alexander's offer. He bends the knee, and Alexander rushes an army to Sicily. King Hamilquard II of Carthage, who is armed primarily with mercenaries, is caught completely off guard, and Alexander takes back the island. It is then that Alexander makes a mistake. He invades Africa. Eager from his victories in Sicily, Alexander continues, ignoring that his is a hastily assembled army that lacks full intelligence. When he lands, a Carthaginian army is waiting for him, and here begins one of the bloodiest battles of antiquity. Both sides lose 10,000 men, and Alexander will only win because of his refusal to give in, despite his losses. Hamilquard eventually retreats, swearing that Alexander is a madman. Alexander, sensing blood, follows, besieging Hamilquard at Tunis. A messenger arrives with dreadful news. Alexander's enemy was rising in the east. King Chandragupta of the Mauryan Empire had been watching Alexander and waiting for the moment when he was distracted and his border looked weak. Now that Alexander was so far away, Chandragupta invaded the Indus River Valley. Furious and understanding that every day is precious, Alexander reaches out to the royal council of Carthage with an offer. Surrender now and live as a vassal state, or fight on with the understanding that Tunis and Carthage will be razed to the ground. At first, the Carthaginians ignore Alexander, but his men are secretly building a tunnel under the walls of Tunis. A few months later, when a portion of the walls collapse, he takes Tunis, destroys every building, and sells the population into slavery. Carthage surrenders the next day. This leaves Alexander free to race across his empire. But distances take time in the ancient world, and he has to stop to gather more troops. This gives Chandragupta the breathing space he needs to take back all the land that Alexander had paid so dearly for in terms of manpower to win in India. Alexander's father-in-law, Oxyates, will try to stop Chandragupta, but will fail spectacularly, dying in the process. Chandragupta will halt after reconsolidating, believing that Alexander will not be so foolhardy as to attempt to invade India a second time. He does not know Alexander. Alexander will cross the Parapamesus Mountains in the winter, making a daring crossing in an attempt to surprise Chandragupta. Chandragupta is indeed caught off guard, allowing Alexander to take back the Indus River Valley. Alexander and Chandragupta clash several times as Alexander heads deeper into India. But Alexander has the larger army, and after all is known as the Great for a reason. He takes some large losses, but Chandragupta is unable to slow Alexander down much until Alexander reaches the Ganges River. On the other side, Chandragupta is waiting with his full army finally assembled. Alexander suffers a crippling defeat, with many of his troops trampled by the feared war elephants. Alexander retreats and then attempts to regroup, still believing he can take Chandragupta. But this is where his men have had enough. They left Babylon with Alexander years ago, on the promise of an easy war in Sicily, and now their lives were being wasted, being thrown at an enemy that is clearly equal in military genius and resources. They refused to cross the Ganges a second time, just as they had refused to cross the Hephaestus River all those years before. On top of the troops wanting to go home, this campaign has been expensive and Alexander is broke. Alexander is forced to make an uneasy truce with Chandragupta, that he will leave the rest of India be and Chandragupta will let Alexander take what he has won. In many ways, Alexander has won a great victory, controlling a large chunk of India. But he returns to Babylon a slightly broken man all the same, depressed to know that there is one enemy he cannot in fact defeat. On the way home to Babylon, Alexander will stop at the city of Persepolis and order it restored, seeking to curry favor with his Persian subjects. He will even undergo the traditional Persian rite of kings, thus fully embracing his identity as an Eastern ruler. The court Alexander was returning to was, after all, no longer truly a Greek court. Alexander's generals had married Eastern women, and together they were having the next generation of noble children that were the ultimate melding of the two worlds. Alexander would never again fight a major campaign after King Chandragupta, feeling that his failure to go further into India was a personal failure. He had always believed he would conquer the world someday, but now he had to let go of that. It was a painful realization for a man worshipped as a god throughout most of his empire. Instead, he would return to Babylon and spend his last few decades creating a strong governmental structure for Alexander IV, finally spending some time with his son. Alexander raises his son to believe that India was the final true enemy of the empire, and that his most important destiny was to destroy the Mauryans. He only achieved some measure of contentment in the idea that someday India would join the empire. Despite his unfulfilled ambitions, Alexander's later years reshaped the cultural fabric of his empire. He becomes the focal point of a new religion, blending Eastern and Western spiritual traditions, and champions the Greek language, which soon becomes the lingua franca across his domains, reaching as far as India. This cultural fusion sparks an intellectual renaissance. Greek and Persian works are studied side by side. Egyptian and Indian texts are translated into Greek, and diverse entertainment traditions flourish. Public games, musical contests, and theatre become widespread, evolving to reflect local customs. Even in architecture, Greek, Persian, and Babylonian styles intertwine, leaving an indelible mark on the cities of Alexander's empire. Alexander is ruling over an empire of 90 million people, the largest in the world. As many of those people were Persian, he pushed his Greek generals to adopt their culture. They wore Persian jewelry, danced their Persian dances, and furnished their houses far more lavishly than the classic Greeks would have approved. Some even took a second wife or bought eunuch servants. In 293, feeling death to be close, King Alexander names his son Alexander as his co-heir. He has never had another boy, due to the mysterious death of his other wife, Queen Statira, while he was away on one of his long campaigns. Queen Roxana worked hard to ensure her son was the only heir. Alexander IV proves himself an adept statesman, and Alexander leaves him in charge with the hope that someday soon he will conquer India. In 290 BCE, Alexander feels the end coming on. He retires to Ecbatana, where he lost his most beloved companion Hephaestion all those years ago. He has missed his old friend, but he knows he made him proud. Secure in the knowledge that his son will continue his legacy, Alexander slips into a coma and dies, muttering Hephaestion's name repeatedly before death. His son, now 33, quickly takes control and throws the most lavish funeral games the world has ever seen. Alexander the Great is dead, but he has left behind a large, wealthy, and well-governed empire that stretches from India to Africa. This era will become known as the Hellenistiki Irene, or Hellenistic peace, and will last for hundreds of years. Then there will be trouble for Alexander's descendants, but that's a story for another day. Seriously though, historians are always going to debate what could have been if Alexander had lived longer. Would he have gone west to Italy, to the Black Sea, invaded India again, or turned towards Arabia? Would his culture-blending projects have worked? It's impossible to say, but the fact remains that regardless, he was one of the greatest military geniuses and visionaries of all time. I hope you like my version. Thanks so much for watching. If you want to hear more what-ifs, like and subscribe.